Yes. Good evening to everyone. We would like to begin this very special and historic annual council, beginning with a word of prayer to place this whole event in the hands of God. May I please ask you to stand up and we begin with a prayer. Lord of the universe, creator of heavens and earth, we come to you now to place everything that is going to be happening during this annual council into your hand. We have come to celebrate you, to praise your name, to uplift you. We have come to celebrate one another because we are all gifts to one another. We thank you for this moment when your people gather to reflect, to come together, to move forward with your purposes for this world until you come. We thank you and surrender completely ourselves to your Holy Spirit in Jesus' name. Amen. I would like at this moment to invite Mr. Jay Gladson. He is the Director of Sales for the Calhoun County Visitors Bureau, and he has some words of welcome for us.
Welcome everyone to Battle Creek and the historic Adventist Village. We are very excited to have you all here with us to experience Battle Creek. I would like to thank Sherry Clemmer and all her staff for all their hard work in bringing this event here to Battle Creek. Please check out the info that we provided in those blue welcome bags I handed all of you today. I'm wearing a suit right now, but I remember seeing all of you earlier. We have dining guides and dining options for vegetarians in there, as long as our visitor guides, so make sure you check out that information I handed out to everyone today. Be sure also to check out our farmers market that's in town from 9 to 1 on Saturday and then on next Wednesday as well, if you get a chance. And you could also get Battle Creek souvenirs and Michigan souvenirs at our Welcome Center, which is located in the Riverwalk building on Jackson Street, right behind the hotel in Kellogg Arena. So if you get a chance, come check that out as well. And thanks again for choosing Battle Creek. This is a great opportunity for Battle Creek to showcase all we have to offer, and we can showcase the great Adventist Village here, and it's a great opportunity for our community to have all of you here. So we appreciate you coming and bringing this prestigious event to Battle Creek. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gladstone. Thank you very much. It is now my distinct privilege to welcome His Excellency Mayor Mark Benke, that we invite to come. He is the mayor of Battle Creek, and we are really very grateful that he took time to come to welcome us. Just before I let you address this audience, I would like to say something very briefly. I read these words that you wrote. He says about Battle Creek, "I want municipal government to be as efficient, creative, and dynamic as that in private business." And then he adds, "Every day, we search for ways to be more accountable and accessible to our customers, the taxpayers." And I want to retain these two words, accountable and accessible. Mr. Mayor, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those kind words, and thank you for being here On behalf of the citizens of the City of Battle Creek, please allow me to read this special proclamation. Whereas for over 150 years, Battle Creek has been home to the Seventh-day Adventists, and whereas Battle Creek was at the forefront of the Seventh-day Adventists becoming one of the fastest growing denominations with 21 million members worldwide. And whereas through the tremendous work and dedication of the General Conference staff, this event has brought close to 800 members to the Battle Creek community. And whereas the event held at the historic Adventist Village right here, Kellogg Arena and McCamley Plaza Hotel provide significant economic impact to the community and business. Therefore, on behalf of the citizens of the City of Battle Creek, we do hereby proclaim today, Thursday, October 11th, 2018, as Seventh-day Adventist Day in the greater Battle Creek area. And we will urge all citizens of the city to recognize the Seventh-day Adventists and the historic Adventist Village for their service to our community. And we want to thank you for your investment, your hard work, and just being here. It just makes me feel very special. Once again, congratulations. Enjoy your stay. I look forward to seeing you again this week. Thank you.
It is a distinct privilege and honor to have Mayor Benke with us tonight. It is also a great privilege to have today named Seventh-day Adventist Day. And also, we'll remember that in about 2 days on the Sabbath, when it is the Lord's special day. But today is Seventh-day Adventist Day, and thank you so much for letting us be part of Battle Creek for many, many years. And by God's grace, I hope all Seventh-day Adventists here are your best citizens.
Thank you.
God bless you, Mayor Benke.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it is our privilege to attend 2018 Annual Council. According to the General Conference bylaws, Articles 13, Section 2, it says a meeting of the General Conference Executive Committee, known as the Annual Council, shall be held annually for the purpose of considering budget requests and making appropriations for the transaction of other business and the adoption of policies that may be necessary in the operation of the worldwide work. To apply this policy, a letter of invitation dating June 26, 2018 was sent to all General Conference Executive Committee members and invitees to invite them to attend the 2018 Annual Council held in Battle Creek, Michigan. Altogether, approximately 473 individuals have been notified. They are made up of 345 General Conference Executive Committee members and 128 invitees. The names are listed in the agenda booklet beginning on page L15. Of these, approximately 218 have registered to attend. The General Conference bylaws, Article 13, Section 4 says, any 15 member of the General Conference Executive Committee, including the office of the General Conference, shall constitute a quorum of the Executive Committee for the disposition of routine items and shall be empowered to transact business that is in harmony with the general plans outlined by the Executive Committee. A quorum of 40 members is required for the disposition of non-routine items such as major financial decisions, the dismissal of elected and appointed employees, and the election of presidents of divisions and of general vice presidents. Mr. Chair, because more than 40 members are present this evening, we eagerly await your call to order of the business meeting of 2018 Annual Council.
All right. Because the requirements have been met, we officially declare the 2018 Annual Council open here in Battle Creek, Michigan.
Mr. Chair, we have agendas that have been sent out ahead of time, and it's in your program booklet. They are in yellow pages, which are the general agenda, then the blue policy agenda, in the green pages, consent agenda, and the church manual agenda, and all have been distributed separately. Mr. Chair, I move that we adopt the agenda.
All right, is there a second? All right, any comments? All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Thank you very much, Brother Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, as our usual custom in every annual council, we read our mission statement. The mission statement of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Section A of the Working Policy states, our mission. The mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is to call all people to become disciples of Jesus Christ, to proclaim the everlasting gospel embraced by the three angels' messages, Revelation 14, 6-12, and to prepare the world for Christ's soon return. Our method, guided by the Bible and the Holy Spirit, Seventh-day Adventists pursue the mission through Christ-like living, communicating, discipling, teaching, healing, and serving. Finally, our vision. In harmony with Bible revelation, Seventh-day Adventists see the climax of God's plan in the restoration of all His creation to full harmony with His perfect will and righteousness. Mr. Chair, I move that we reaffirm the mission statement of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
All right, thank you, Brother Ng. And all those in favor of reaffirming our mission statement, including our method and our vision, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, we have the programs and agenda material in your program booklet. As previously announced by email, the 2018 Annual Council Program and Agenda are available electronically on our particular website. So, Mr. Chair, I move that we adopt the daily programs as found on pages A, B, and C.
All right, is there a second? Any comments? All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, we have two standing committees that have to be voted. They are on page 29 of the agenda booklet. The first one is the nominating committee, and the second one is the steering committee. So, Mr. Chair, I move that we approve these two standing committees for the 2018 Annual Council.
Thank you. Is there a second? All right. Comments? All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Ng, for this introductory part of our 2018 Annual Council. And what a historic opportunity it is to look at the past with a future, looking back to move forward in mission led by God Himself. And now our lead conference will begin. I know you will be enriched and greatly blessed by God's presence and how we can see in the past His leading and how He will lead us in the future. May God bless each one of you and welcome to Battle Creek.
Amen.
I have to recognize that I feel a little out of place after having our leaders here with the pioneers' costumes. And I just want to say a couple of words regarding the materials that you have on your bags that you received today. Another couple of comments about tomorrow's activities, and then we will begin with Pastor Jim Nix and Pastor William Fagel and Sister Sherry Clemmer for a special moment that we're going to have every day until the end of annual council. Perhaps that you have seen in your bags that you received a little thumb drive or a memory card that has the theme of the lead conference, and you wonder what's inside. Don't worry, there's no virus in there. What we have there is 29 videos of the different places here in Battle Creek that were filmed with Pastor Jim Nix, so that when you go back home, when you talk about the annual council and the lead conference that we had here in Battle Creek, you can show your church members, you can show your colleagues what we did during this weekend. This is part of a bigger project that Hope Channel is working on that will come out in February or March next year with over 100 stories about our pioneers, not only here in Battle Creek, but also in North England, on New England. Something else that you have on your bags, you may have noticed that you have some lace ties, different models. You have shawls for the ladies on Sabbath, and you can wear them tomorrow, you can wear them on Sabbath, but on Sabbath specifically, we would like to ask you, and this is not mandatory, but we would like to ask you that if on Sabbath morning, when we have our Sabbath school and our church service at the Tabernacle Church in Battle Creek, that you could wear this. We're going to take, between Sabbath school and church worship service, we're going to take an official photo inside of the Tabernacle Church, where we're trying to get everyone, every executive committee member in the photo. So we will have a memoir of the lead conference of this year. On the programs that you receive, we need to make a couple of adjustments on it. For tomorrow, we had planned of having communion service in the 1857 meeting house, just on the side here, for all that wanted to have a little taste of what communion service must have been on those pioneer times. Because of other activities, we are needing to cancel the 9:30 and the 1:15 communion service. So if you had scheduled and you had put your name for those times, you can do it any other time during the day, but tomorrow 9:30 and 1:15 communion services. Also, you may have noticed that we prepared a nice little hymn book that we're going to be using the whole lead conference and annual council. You will love when we sing it with Jim and William. But we realized a couple of days before coming here that we were missing some songs. So you will have inside of that hymn book a supplement. Please bring it together so that we can all sing praises to our Lord. One last comment. Some of you parked in the Dollar Tree or Family Dollar parking space. The owners of that shop are wanting their customers to park there. And they will be calling the tow service truck for those of you that park there and not actually buying anything at this store. So if you parked your car there, make sure you find another parking space, because you may be having to get your car tomorrow from the council garage. Thank you very much. Jim, William, and Sherry, please.
Good evening. Welcome to Battle Creek once again, and welcome especially to historic Adventist Village. You will be greeted, you will be hosted by a number of our volunteers and board members the next couple of days while you're here in the village. And they want to make certain that your time here is special and it is a blessing to you. And so we have volunteers that have come in from across the United States just to serve you this weekend. Now, as far as the song service, this one and the rest of them during lead conference tomorrow and on into annual council, we've tried to choose songs, old pioneer Adventist songs, from the topic or that deal with the topic that will be presented. So tonight it's about mission. So we're going to look at a few songs about mission, the church. And the first one is on page 12 in your book, Rescue the Perishing. A story about the background of this hymn, 1869. Fanny Crosby went to a city mission in New York City. And there she met some of the people that were really down and out on their luck, as we would say. And she was moved afterwards to write this hymn about rescuing the perishing. Bill, who has a much better singing voice than I have, he's going to lead the singing, and we will do the first and third stanzas of page 12 in your book. And if we're lucky, we will have the words also on the screen.
Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, snatch them in pity from sin and the grave. Weep o'er the erring one, lift up the fallen, tell them of Jesus the mighty to save. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save. Rescue the perishing, duty demands it, strength for thy labor the Lord will provide. Back to the narrow way, patiently win them, tell the poor wanderer a Savior has died. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save.
When I said that these were early Adventist hymns, they're not all early, but they are all from the era that is represented in the village. What we represent here in historic Adventist Village is 1852 to 1902. So all the hymns that we will be singing the next few days were in an Adventist hymnal that came out sometime between 1852 and 1902. The first hymnal that had this particular Adventist hymnal that had this particular hymn was the 1900 edition of Christ in Song. Now we're going to pages 14 and 15, throw out the Lifeline that was written in 1886. And again, the first hymnal to carry this one, first Adventist hymnal, was the 1900 edition of Christ in Song, which many of you will have the 1908 edition. That's the one that was used for many, many years. The 1900 edition is a bit rarer. Anyway, there was a shipwreck along the coast of Massachusetts, and Reverend Edward Ufford, I'm not sure how he pronounced the name, who was living there, he was walking along the beach and saw this wreck where a ship had gone down. And he tried to imagine what it must have been like. And so he then wrote this hymn, Throw Out the Lifeline. And we will do stanzas 1 and 6, pages 14 and 15 in your hymn book.
The lifeline across the dark wave, someone should save somebody's brother. Who then will dare to throw out the lifeline, his peril to share? Throw out the lifeline, throw out the lifeline, someone is drifting away. Throw out the lifeline, throw out the lifeline, someone is sinking today. Verse 6. Jesus is able to you who are driven farther and farther from God and from Him, helpless and hopeless, overwhelmed by the wave. We throw out the lifeline, 'tis Jesus can save. Throw out the lifeline, throw out the lifeline, someone is drifting away. Throw out the lifeline, throw out the lifeline, someone is sinking today.
Our next hymn is page 13, and it is a children's gospel song, actually. I remember singing it as a young person myself many years ago. Not quite 100 years ago, but it's getting there. Anyway, but it is for some of you too, so quit laughing, all right? Anyway, this song is based on a true incident. Many years ago, a missionary visited a dying boy in a tent in a gypsy encampment in England. And bending over the dying boy, he recited John 3:16 about God so loving the world. When he had finished, the dying boy, listening very intently to the recitation of that verse, whispered to the man, "Nobody ever told me." And it is the background for this particular hymn. And so we will sing, stanzas 1 and 4 of this hymn.
Into the tent where a gypsy boy lay, dying alone at the close of the day. News of salvation we carried, said he. Nobody ever has told it to me. Tell it again, tell it again. Salvation story repeat o'er and o'er, till none can say of the children of men, nobody ever has told me before. Smiling said he as his last sigh he spent, I am so glad that for me he was sent. Whispered while low sank the sun in the west, Lord, I believe, tell it now to the rest. Tell it again, tell it again. Salvation story repeat o'er and o'er, till none shall say of the children of men, nobody ever has told me before.
The next hymn that we will be singing is number 9, Far and Nearer, on page number 9. Far and near the fields are teeming. And when Bill and I originally talked, we said we would sing stanzas 1 and 3. However, since I could find absolutely nothing about this hymn, I have nothing about the background of this hymn, we will spend the brief time that I would have used to tell you about the hymn to sing all 3 stanzas.
Far and near the fields are teeming with the sheaves of rye. sheaves together, ere the harvest time pass by. Verse 2. Send them forth with morn's first beaming, send them in the noontide's glare, when the sun's last rays are streaming, bid them gather everywhere. Lord of harvest, send forth reapers, hear us, Lord, to thee we cry. Send them now the sheaves together, ere the harvest time pass by. O thou whom thy Lord is sending, gather now the sheaves of gold. Heavenward then at evening wending, thou shalt come with joy untold. Lord of harvest, send forth reapers, hear us, Lord, to thee we cry. Send them now the sheaves together, ere the harvest time pass by.
All right, our opening hymn this evening is number 16, but you will need the supplement because there was a little typo mistake and some of the lines didn't get into the book. So you need the supplement, but it will have page 16 there. And we will sing that. We'll stand in a minute to sing the opening hymn, all three stanzas. But before we do, I want to invite you to a very special opening that you're here in the village. Immediately after the meeting this evening, there will be an opening of our newest exhibit, which is just around the corner from our visitor center. And it is a replica of the 1855 publishing house. I know it's chilly out there, and we will do our best to keep it very short, but we would like to invite all of you that are interested in seeing what size our publishing work began. It's an exact full-scale replica of our first little publishing house from 1855.
All right, on this one, you know, the men have the melody and the chorus, and the ladies well, it's the basses that have the melody. The ladies and the tenors have the harmony part that chimes in. So let's see if we can do all of that. Let's stand as we sing. Seeking the lost, yes, kindly entreating wanderers on the mountain astray. Come unto me, his message repeating, words of the Master speaking today. Going afar upon the mountain, bringing the wanderer back again into the fold of my Redeemer, Jesus the Lamb for sinners slain. Seeking the lost and pointing to Jesus, souls that are weak and hearts that are sore, leading them forth in ways of salvation, showing the path to life evermore. Going afar upon the mountain, bringing the wanderer back again into the fold of my Redeemer, Jesus the Lamb for sinners slain. Thus I would go missions of mercy, following Christ from day unto day, cheering the faint and raising the fallen, pointing the lost to Jesus the way, going afar upon the mountain, bringing the wanderer back again into the fold of my Redeemer, Jesus the Lamb for sinners slain.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Jim, before you step down from the stage here, can you come a little here and explain to us? I found that this pulpit here, it's a little old. What can you tell us about it?
Well, the last I checked, the General Conference stole it from the White Estate Visitor Center. Is that what you meant?
No. I am sure that somebody asked to bring it from there, but I don't recall who that was. But let's forget that.
This is a pulpit that Ellen White preached from, and he liked the size. He must be getting old if he doesn't remember who asked. But anyway, seriously, this is a pulpit that Ellen White preached from. We usually have it on display in the visitor center. I think most of you have been to our visitor center. If not, certainly want to invite you to come, and when you're at the General Conference. But we're glad to be able to share it this weekend.
And thank you for lending it to us. Can I take it home for a little while, or probably not? Okay.
Well, I understand that Elder Wilson has you living at the General Conference most of the time, so you probably could take it home.
Oh.
I'm sorry. I'm going to have a good time this weekend. I hope you plan on having one too.
We are all going to have a good time. Now, explain to me, what is that? Is that a piano, an organ? What is it?
Well, it's an old pump organ.
And where did you get it from?
I have no idea. Well, I mean, what can I say? We have probably 10 or 15 of these things that have been donated to the village, and we don't have that many buildings, so they found the one they thought sounded the nicest, and that's the one they brought over here, but I don't know where each one of those individual ones came from. But they were donations from people who are supporting the program. But exactly who, I can't give credit. I'm sorry.
Okay. But is there one somewhere that was played back in the early days of the church that we have?
The one in the 1857 meeting house, that would go back to the Bordeauxville Church. I don't know what year they purchased it, but that would go back to the Bordeauxville, Vermont Church, which is one of our old churches. It was built in the 1860s. So I'm not sure that organ is quite that old. I'm not sure about the age of the pump organ in the Parkville Church.
But for those of you that are having communion service tomorrow at the meeting house, you're going to see that the organ there, or how is it that it's called?
It's a pump organ. Parlor organ.
Pump organ.
Pump organ.
You are going to know that dates back to the early pioneer there.
Well, yeah, if you're going to be there in the meeting house, and the only way I guess that you're going to get there is go to communion service, because it's not open for tours tomorrow. But everything that's in that building goes back to Parkville. So when you're sitting in there on those pews, those have been used continuously by Seventh-day Adventists since 1862. So, and the pulpit has been used continuously in the Parkville Church until it was donated here to the village since 1862. So you're surrounded, even though the building is a replica, you are surrounded with very historic furnishings that are in our meeting house.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
We want to introduce to you tonight Dr. David Trim. David Trim, he is the director of ASTR, Adventist Statistics, and come on, help me, David.
Archive Statistics and Research.
Archives, Statistics. Come. You know that English is not my first language, so sometimes I do get a little confused. But thank you for being with us tonight. Looking forward to hearing.
Thank you very much, Mike Dill. Good evening, brothers and sisters. And those words are particularly appropriate in a place such as this. It's unfortunate that I've been given a job title that no one can remember. Except me. ASTR is easier to say. And I'm just going to do something dangerous and briefly improvise. But sitting here, I was struck by the fact that we are following so literally in the footsteps of our pioneers, because in May 1863, when this church was founded, they met on May 20 and 21 for business meetings, but they hadn't finished, and yet they adjourned until May 23, and they all went the next 2 days into a big tent that was pitched on Battle Creek Green where they were conducting evangelistic meetings. Does that not say something about the Seventh-day Adventist Church? So here we are in a big tent pitched on something like the green of Battle Creek, literally following in our forefathers and foremothers' footsteps. From the Apostle Paul's epistle to the Romans, chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, I beseech you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. This is your true and proper service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may test and prove what the will of God is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. This is the word of the Lord. On November 3, 1920, Eva May Clements died in Rangoon, the capital city of Burma, today's Yangon in Myanmar. And I think if we can move on. You see here what was then called Rangoon in the 1920s. We know little of the life of Eva May Clements, and there is no known photograph of her. She had been born on July 25, 1897, near Bundaberg in northern Queensland, then a British colony, though when she was 3 it became a state of a new nation, Australia. We know nothing more about her until September 1914, when at the age of 16, Eva took a position in the headquarters of the Australasian Union Conference in Sydney. She worked there for more than 5 years in stenographic, secretarial work until in January 1920 she was called to serve as stenographer to the president of the Southern Asia Division in Lucknow, India. She was an administrative assistant, we would say in the General Conference today, and today we would not call an international service employee, as we call missionaries, to work in a clerical capacity. But in 1920 there were merely 1,000 members across the whole of India, and probably no local believer who combined stenographic experience with familiarity in the language of denominational administration, which then as now was a particular dialect. The fact that the call for a stenographer went to Eva suggests something about her character, and it suggests she was good at her work. So does the fact that when people spoke of Eva, and there's not many times we find it, but there are a few, they regularly call her devoted to her work. And they speak of to the Adventist message. And so Eva accepted the call, and on March 3, 1920, She departed Sydney on the P&O steamer Mantua, which you see on the screen, sailing for Bombay via Melbourne and Colombo. Having landed in what today is Mumbai, she took the train for the 880-mile journey to Lucknow, where she arrived safely on March 29, 1920. It was only 84 days since the General Conference Committee had voted to approve the request of John E. Fulton, the division president, that, quote, Australia supply a stenographer to India. Fulton had only arrived in India himself the previous year, but he'd been president of the Australasian Union and he knew Eva, and it's likely that he proposed her in particular as the stenographer to be sent. If so, it suggests that she had expressed interest in mission service already, but we don't really know for sure. Eva seems to have settled well into her life in Lucknow. According to her obituary, she entered heartily into her work at the Lucknow office and much enjoyed life. And she was popular among her new colleagues thanks to what one called a bright disposition and a spirit of helpfulness. A former colleague in Sydney recalled that in her letters from Lucknow, she had no complaints to make concerning the climate or culture in India, while in one of those letters, Eva wrote, "I want to tell you that I am glad I came to India." She had been there for less than 5 months when on around August 31st, she left with Fulton's wife, Susan, on an itinerary to Burma, then part of the Southern Asia Division. They were intending to meet in Rangoon with John Fulton, who was then in southern India. But Susan and Eva traveled separately, first by rail from Lucknow to Kolkata. Remember that, we'll come back to it at the end. And then by ship to the port town of Mulmeen in southeast Burma, and finally by small boat up the great Salween River to Kamamong, a remote mission station where they stayed for 2 or 3 weeks. They stayed with the Fulton's daughter Agnes and her husband, this man Eric B. Hare, later to become legendary for his mission story. Lucknow was a huge city, a center of culture and civilization for centuries, celebrated by writers such as Rudyard Kipling. At Kamamong, they were 80 miles from the nearest European. Eva, I would guess, thought, now I'm really getting into the mission field. She and Mrs. Fulton enjoyed the time, but Eva suffered from fever. Still, it seemed to pass, and in October they moved to Rangoon, where they met Elder Fulton, who had a series of meetings culminating at the end of the month in a 10-day meeting, general meeting of the Burma Union Mission that had only been founded the year before. Now, even though Fulton was away from the office, he was still transacting presidential business. Some of you know how that goes. And so, in early October, Eva was kept busy with presidential correspondence. Later in the month, as Mrs. Fulton later recalled, she spent much time writing programs for meetings and copying budgets. And Eva kept up this work, Susan Fulton wrote, almost to the day she died. For unfortunately, Eva developed appendicitis and had to be admitted to Rangoon General Hospital. On the penultimate morning of that union session, which was a Sabbath, October 30, 1920, she had her appendix removed, apparently without complications. Now, Rangoon General Hospital was a modern institution. She ought to have recovered, but the fever contracted in Kamamong continued to affect her. It had weakened her. And in fact, visiting her the night before the operation, the Fultons noted that though she was quite cheerful, she was anxious, quote, that her illness might terminate fatally. And sadly, her concern was just. On the night of the 31st, she slipped into a coma. She never regained consciousness. In the early morning of November 3, 1920, she passed away. Without the strain and sickness that arose from her missionary service, Eva would almost certainly have successfully recuperated from a relatively routine surgery. As Susan Fulton wrote, her term of service in India was short indeed. Full of grief, Fulton wrote too, "We cannot understand why one so young, so eager to serve, so greatly needed in the mission field should be so suddenly taken away from us." Eva May Clements was just 23 years old. She'd been in the mission field for just 7 months. From the time her call was voted by the General Conference to the time she was buried was a mere 10 months. And perhaps some of you, having listened to me, may be thinking, why tell this story in Battle Creek? What's the point? What's its significance? Surely there must be a catch. There's going to be a surprise ending. There must be something to explain why I'm telling you this sad little story of a long-forgotten woman. Did she have children, perhaps, that I haven't mentioned yet? Did she have a cousin who became a division president or a GC departmental director? Did a niece grow up and, inspired by stories of Aunt Eva, become an immensely successful missionary somewhere else? Did her staunchness in death inspire onlookers so much that a local government official or tribal leader became converted? The answer is no, no, no. She had no children, no famous relatives, and her death had an impact on only a small circle. Eva May lived in near anonymity. She died in obscurity, and she rests in a neglected cemetery, far from her original home, far even from the adopted home and the colleagues who had barely got to know her. Circumstances conspired to consign Eva Clements to oblivion. Her friends and family back in Australia grieved when the telegram arrived, but their lives moved on. So why do I tell this story? Partly because Eva is not alone in not being remembered. Too often we tell the same few stories from Adventist history. Perhaps there's a particular danger of that in Battle Creek. But Adventist history is deep, and it is wide, and it is full of stories of dedicated men and women who quite literally took their lives in their hands, but did so because they had put their lives in the hands of the Holy Spirit. And so they were willing to risk danger, deprivation, disease, death. And in many cases, they truly gave their all so that the prophetic messages of the angels of Revelation 14 might be proclaimed, that this church might be built up and that Jesus might be lifted up. And yet those people are generally moldering in obscurity. And so another reason for starting with Eva's fatal story is because though forgotten for so long, some parts of her story can be recovered, as I just did with you. We know almost nothing of what she thought or what she felt. But at least we can piece together a timeline for the last year of her life to a degree that's impossible for many others. And there were many, many other missionaries who died while in the mission field. And Eva stands for them, and in particular for the many who passed away soon after arriving overseas. And I'll tell you some of their stories. I'll summarize them quickly. The lives of people about whom little is known other than their sacrifices and their suffering. Eva's experiences can stand in some sense for theirs. They serve to remind us that every missionary had a story. No matter how anonymous their decease, they were wives and daughters, sons and husbands, beloved in life, lamented in death. And so I also tell this story partly because the tragedy it represents was not uncommon. It is not just Eva's poignant, premature death, but its apparent pointlessness, which makes it tragic. Eva May Clements never accomplished great deeds for Jesus, but she never had the chance to. She did her work diligently and cheerfully, but before she could achieve anything noteworthy, she was cut down in the prime of life because she was willing to give her life in order that others might have eternal life. And in that willingness to serve, to risk literally life and limb, her life was surely not pointless, not in the eyes of her Heavenly Father, but also, I hope, not in your eyes. I tell the stories of Eva and of many other martyrs to Adventist mission to remind us of the true foundations of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. When it was established 155 years ago, its 3,500 members were only found in the northeast and midwest of the United States, with a handful in Canada. Today, its members are found in almost every country of the world. And today we can too easily take that outcome for granted because we know how the story turned out. But commitment and sacrifice were required to a degree that today is rare. Past generations of Adventists willingly undertook what Paul calls the Christian's proper service to God, presenting their bodies as living sacrifices. So this evening we're stressing the sacrifices and commitment of missionaries, but I also will be highlighting the fact that in our first 100 years, there was rarely a shortage of recruits willing to pay the ultimate price. Friends, there is still a worldwide need for service. Still areas where the Adventist presence is minimal and tenuous. Places where missionaries have a vital part to play, not in large institutions, but in coming close to people by personal effort. The words of Ellen G. White in Ministry of Healing. We still need missionaries today. The stories of either Clements and other forgotten heroes of this church, the ones who did not become division or GC officers or departmental directors, but who gave their lives both literally and figuratively, their stories have a power still to move us, I think. They have the power to inspire both young and old to recommit to the prophetic mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Friends, today we often have a very romanticized view of mission service. This is partly because our knowledge comes from mission stories, whether those told to camp meeting audiences by returned missionaries such as Eric B. Hare, or those published as didactic and inspirational short books by church publishing houses in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the sorts of books I grew up reading, and I suspect quite a number of you did. While many of these stories do say something about the risks missionaries took, the stories remain upbeat, stressing divine blessing in the face of distress and difficulties, and they gloss over suffering. Burnished by time and the storyteller's art, even disagreeable conditions and deadly dangers could take on a lustrous glow. In the 21st century, we overlook the dangers of mission service in the 19th and 20th centuries when the Adventist Church began to expand around the world. In 1902, William Spicer, then Secretary of the Foreign Mission Board, set the situation out starkly but candidly. Those who go into the fields must be ready to lay down their lives, and at the least must be ready to lay everything they have upon the altar of service. And in writing thus, Spicer was being neither sentimental nor theoretical, for he had been a missionary himself, and he had suddenly and unexpectedly become superintendent of the India mission when its first superintendent, Doris Robinson, died of smallpox, a story we'll come back to. But Spicer knew of what he spoke. We forget that going as a missionary meant taking one's life in one's hands. Now, this is true for everyone. In 1900, there were 17,400 Christian missionaries worldwide. 1900 is, of course, just before the GC headquarters left Battle Creek. Of those 17,500 almost missionaries, more than 92% were from Western countries. Only 1 in 6 of those was working in Africa because of the high risk of disease and death. At this stage, one historian writes, there were still no answers to the killer diseases, malaria and sleeping sickness. In West Africa, the casualty rate among Western missionaries at this time was so high that they were expected to live 2 years. And this poor life expectancy was true of Adventist missionaries too. They often quickly succumbed to and frequently died of a range of tropical diseases, fevers, and other often unknown infectious diseases. And this is the case all around the world, not just in West Africa. The 2-year average, of course, implies both shorter and longer lifespans, but clustering around the 2-year mark. So Eva Clements was far from unique in that short period she served as a missionary. And I'm going to give you a number of actual examples from Southern Asia, the islands of the South Pacific, the Middle East, Central America, and the Caribbean. I could, if time permitted, have added many, many more examples, and from Southeast Asia and East Asia as well. The brief snippets of missionary lives cut short, sometimes apparently to no end, bring home the cost of service, and may lead us to wonder, is the spirit of sacrifice for mission, of sacrifice to enter unentered countries, to reach unreached and underreached peoples, is that spirit of sacrifice still alive? Or is it, like many of the missionaries in our past, now sickening, ailing, failing? On October 3, 1895, a party of 4 American missionaries disembarked at the port of Cape Coast, which you see here in what was then called the Gold Coast, a British colony in West Africa, today's Ghana. These 4 missionaries joined a body of local believers started by Francis Dolphine, who asked for a missionary to be sent. And you can see him here. He is standing in the middle and in the back, the man standing at the back. But Dolphine had asked for missionaries, and so they were sent. Dudley Hale was the leader, the man sitting on the right as you look at him. With him were G.P. Riggs, of whom no photograph survives, and the man sitting next to Hale with his wife behind him, George and Eva Kerr. Also with them were the Kerrs' 2 children who are not pictured. Within 8 months of their arrival, remember it was October 3, 1895, within 8 months both children had died. And Hale and Riggs had both been shipped to Liverpool in England for treatment. Hale for malaria, Riggs for severe dysentery. Riggs was eager to return, but he never recovered despite the treatment, and he died on January 8, 1897. From Riggs's arrival at Cape Coast to his death in Liverpool was just 15 months. Hale recovered and eventually returned to the Gold Coast in 1903, but was again forced by malaria to leave almost immediately, but still, he lived. In 1909, this man, C.E.F. Thompson, a Jamaican, went with his wife as a missionary to the Gold Coast. Perhaps IAD's first foreign missionary, and also perhaps the best-dressed Adventist of the early 20th century as you look at him. Sadly, the 2-year window applied to Thompson. In the 24 months, the first 24 months, he won some 30 converts, but then he contracted kidney disease. He went to Freetown, Sierra Leone to seek treatment, but on March 25, 1912, he died, leaving his wife a widow. In 1908, Thomas and Catherine French, both teachers, accepted a call to work in education in Sierra Leone, arriving there in May 1908. Both suffered from malaria there, but they survived. But after 2.5 years, they were moved to the Gold Coast, Ghana, and to the mission station of Axim, where Thompson had worked. And they had been there only a few days when on January 17, 1911, Catherine was taken ill with a severe attack of black water fever, as her husband Thomas described it. She lived just 1 more day, dying of heart failure on January 18, 1911. In describing her passing, Thomas evokes both the bewilderment and the distress, and yet somehow also the determination that is typical of many Adventist missionaries who faced his situation. He wrote, "As I stood beside my dying companion a few days ago and realized my own strength was fast failing, in my perplexity my mind turned to my brethren and sisters at home who so nobly support this cause by their prayers and by their means, and the question came forcibly to me, what can this crisis mean? We appeal to our people at home to support the languishing hands of our workers in these heathen strongholds. Brethren and sisters, seek God earnestly in behalf of his cause in West Africa." God's cause needed to be upheld in other parts of Africa too, of course. And in other parts of Africa too, missionaries faced their mortality. On July 5, 1894, a party of 7 Seventh-day Adventists had arrived in Bulawayo, new capital of the most recent acquisition of the British Empire, Rhodesia, covering today Zambia and Zimbabwe. The Adventists established a mission station at Solusi in Zimbabwe. Now, most of them returned soon after to South Africa, leaving, this is the university today, and they left a South African layman, Fred Sparrow, in charge of the property. In July 1895, a year later, a second party of missionaries arrived. It included Elder George B. Tripp, who became the first superintendent of the Solusi mission. It also included his wife Mary and son George Jr. Mary was the boy's stepmother, and she and George Sr. had only married in March, immediately before departing America for South Africa. And as we'll see, this is true for many missionaries. They married right before leaving for foreign service. Other missionaries in the 1895 party included Elder William H. Anderson and his wife Nora, Dr. A.S. Carmichael, and Fred Sparrow's brother Chris and his wife Mahala, who helped to manage the mission farm. And here you see Chris Sparrow and the African workers on the farm from Solusi. They all worked there for nearly 3 years. In 1897, Frank Armitage, another American missionary, joined them with his wife Annie and their daughter Violet. Annie was the younger sister of GC President Ola Olson. She and Frank were both 33, and they both served as missionaries less than 12 months. For in 1898, a malaria epidemic swept across Britain's Rhodesian colonies. Dr. Carmichael contracted the disease on February 14, and 2 weeks later he died. The Tripp family all fell ill, and though Mary Tripp survived on March 7, George died. You see his grave pictured here. And on the same day, so did Chris Sparrow's young daughter, whose name is not even known. Her mother, Mahala, was laid to rest by the side of her daughter in the cemetery at Solusi. On April 8, George Tripp Jr. died and was buried next to his father. You see here the graves, which are still at Solusi. They still lie there, silent, awaiting the return of Christ. And I'm grateful to Gideon Reinecker of SID for these photos. Meanwhile, Annie Armitage had been taken seriously ill. It was decided to send, remember this is the GC president's sister, it was decided to send her to Cape Town, but even though they took the expense of sending her on the newly constructed railroad, she never made it. She died en route. Dr. William Anderson, who survived, wrote a report that was published in the Review and Herald. He stressed that the epidemic had carried off not just missionaries alone, but also many local believers, and it was about them who he was concerned. Not merely their mortal lives, but their eternal futures. Oh, for men and women to give their lives, if need be, for this people, he wrote. We need young men and women, those who can stand the change of climate, who can easily acquire the language, or as today we would say, get used to the culture, who are strong in faith and who do not easily yield to discouragement. We need those who are willing to leave their country, kindred and homes to lead others to the promised land. In April 1912, Charles Lindsay Nelson, known as Lynn, his wife Ida, who was 5 years younger, and their daughter Ethel, sailed for South Africa. They took up station at Tsungwezi Mission, in what was also Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. And here you see, no you don't see, I apologize. Not to worry. Well, we have photos of them, but taken 7 years later when they were a widow and orphan. Because in 1913 there was an outbreak of smallpox at Tsungwezi, and Lynn contracted the disease. His wife recorded he had complications which made it difficult and painful for him to breathe. On June 2 he died, aged 32, leaving Ida a widow at age 35. News of his, and this shows how communication spread, news of his death was received the next day at the 1913 General Conference session. Ida had sent a telegram with this simple but deeply sad message: my husband died yesterday at 1 p.m. He had served at Tsungwezi just a year. It was not Africa alone where Adventist pioneers risked death. It was a danger too in the same hemisphere as the homeland that many of them had. For example, David C. Babcock and his wife Elmira, American missionaries, arrived in British Guyana in February 1900. Elmira died on June 20, 1901, after only 4 months. Albert and Ida Fisher, who pastored near the location of the current GC headquarters in Maryland, went as missionaries to the newly acquired American colony of Puerto Rico. They disembarked there in October 1901. Less than 6 months later, Albert died of typhoid fever. He was 31. And another missionary in Puerto Rico, A.J. Hazemer, wrote back to the States. Albert, this is a picture of his wife from her passport, but Hazemer wrote back that Albert was afraid that many would think that he and his wife had made a mistake in coming to this field. He wished me to express his strong belief that the Lord had sent them, and to state that he didn't regret the move they had taken, but that if the Lord should call him aside to rest a while, he was glad to be found at his post of duty. Charles W. Enoch, a nurse and masseur who worked at Portland Sanitarium in Oregon, was inspired to go as a self-supporting missionary to the Caribbean with his brother, George. They landed at Port of Spain, Trinidad, in January 1907 and opened treatment rooms. But on February 6, 1907, Charles died of yellow fever. He served in Trinidad maybe a month. Ovid Davis, who had actually succeeded Babcock as superintendent of the Guyana mission in 1906, wrote grimly, "This makes 3 of our workers laid away in Port of Spain." But George was almost upbeat, using words similar to those Hazemer used about Fisher. "I am thankful," George wrote of Charles, "that he died at his post of duty. I'm glad, or thankful. We have no regrets to offer, but take this bereavement as one more link to bind our lives on the altar of missionary endeavor." George Enoch acknowledges that our hearts are bowed in sadness, but his real concern is evident when he writes, "Still the thought presses heavily upon us, will this branch of the work in the West Indies, which we," he and his brother, "strove together so hard to get upon its feet, be now left to languish for the lack of consecrated workers?" Again and again, missionaries cared as much for the future of the work as for themselves or their friends and family. Other islands far from the Caribbean were also dangerous places in terms of disease. In 1903, Dr. Alfred M. Vollmer and his wife Maud accepted a call to serve at the Adventist Sanitarium in Samoa. As his obituary in the review records, he was in Samoa only 2 years. He contracted tuberculosis, and in 1905 he was sent back to the States for treatment. Although, the report continues, the Lord was merciful and spared his life to reach home on the voyage, Vollmer, it says, suffered a great deal the last few weeks of his life, and he did not long survive the return, dying on February 15, 1906, aged just 30 years of age, leaving a widow and young orphaned daughter. In 1915, to move from one South Pacific island to another, in 1915, Norma Wiles, a recent graduate of Australasian Missionary College, today's Avondale, was called to serve in the New Hebrides, today's nation of Vanuatu. Norman immediately proposed to Alma Butts, herself the daughter of missionaries to the South Pacific, and they were married. In 1916, they went to Vanuatu. Norman was then aged 23 and Alma 22. They were threatened with being killed and consumed in a cannibal feast, but they won the local people over, and Norman suffered a different fate. After 4 years of service, on May 1, 1920, Norman suddenly succumbed to blackwater fever. He contracted it May 1. On May 5, he died, aged 27. Alma buried her husband with the help of the locals and then returned to the mission headquarters alone. In 1915, 2 young Australians, Hubert Tolhurst and his wife Pearl, were married. You can see Pearl here with her family 8 years earlier. She's the one on the far right as you look at her. When they married, Hubert was 25 and Pearl was 24, and within weeks of their wedding, they sailed for Tonga, where they set up a mission station on an isolated island group known as the Ha'apai. In 1919, the islands are touched by an appalling epidemic, pneumonic plague, the Black Death that affected 14th century Europe. As an obituary describes, Hubert and Pearl toiled long hours ministering to the sick and stricken people and then succumbed to the plague themselves. Pearl died on March 14, 1919, after weeks of illness. She was the first student from Avondale College to give her life in mission service in the New Hebrides. She was just 28. She had been in the islands 4 years. And as one of her friends later recalled, alone, Hubert washed his wife's body, dressed it, dug a grave, conducted the funeral service, and then buried her. Two other graduates of Australasian Missionary College, Elsie Morgan and Clarence Davis, married early in 1915, planning to go as missionaries to China. They landed at Nanjing on September 30, 1915, and as one of their colleagues wrote, Clarence little thought they would be permitted to live together but 6 weeks in the mission field. Elsie died Nanjing, we'd say today, November 12, 1915, after a brief illness of but 10 hours, and this again is from her obituary. She was only 22, and she died before she'd seen barely anything of the world, much less her chosen mission field. But as so often, her passing was used as an occasion to urge greater missionary effort. In the obituary, her dying words are reported, "Jesus knows all about it, and it's all right." She and Clarence were among the first Australian missionaries to go to China, and Elsie was the first of them to die. The obituary posed a rhetorical question. May not her death be a call to the young men and women of the Australasian Union to consecrate their lives for service in the needy Orient? It was not only Westerners who went as missionaries and died. Benny Tavodi, a Fijian convert, went as a missionary to Dutch New Guinea, what today is Indonesia, in June 1908. He served there for more than a decade, but in October 1918 he died in Papua of snakebite. If the tropical zones were particularly dangerous, however, missionary service was dangerous anywhere, including in regions that are better known for deserts than for jungle. For example, in January 1904, J.G. Teschner, a German male nurse of whom almost nothing is known, had arrived in Jerusalem, where he used to work in the church's clinic there. Less than 6 months later, he died of fever. The Review and Herald reported he had but landed in Syria when he was called to lay down his armor. In 1902, William Wakeham and his wife Emma were called to Egypt, where Wakeham was superintendent of the Oriental Union Mission. They served in the Middle East for 4 years, and in this photo you can see William with a group of Armenian church workers he was training. He is, of course, seated in the front row towards the right. But then came a time during which a colleague wrote, the family were exposed to many hardships and suffered from smallpox and other diseases. But, he wrote, Sister Wakeham, being a trained nurse, was able by the Lord's help to bring her children through this trying ordeal, but with the extreme heat of Egypt, in addition to what she had otherwise endured, her health broke. On May 6, 1906, they took ship for Southampton, hoping that the sea voyage, and this is what her husband wrote, hoping that the sea voyage would enable her, would relieve her. And at the time, her husband wrote, she was suffering a rapid breaking down of all the vital powers. They hoped treatment in England would effect a cure, but she died off the coast of Spain. She was buried at sea on May 13, and Wakeham emotionally recorded the death of my dear wife Emma in her 46th year. Friends, remember, these are Victorians, Edwardians. They don't give themselves to emotional language. You have to pick out the emotion from between the slightly restrained words. But Wakeham continued to pay tribute. She has always been a loving wife, a devoted mother, an unselfish and untiring worker for suffering humanity. 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, feel keenly this great loss. With hearts sad and sore, yet buoyed up by the blessed hope, we committed her body to old ocean's arms, confident that although no monument marks her resting place, she will not be overlooked when the life-giver calls the sleeping saints. But he concluded this way: we do not know the meaning of this bereavement. Our loss, Egypt's loss. The same year, a medical missionary, Dr. Arthur George, became director of the Turkish mission. Within 2 years, he had developed a bad case of tuberculosis, but George clung to his work too long for the good of his health, as a fellow missionary observed. In the end, a successor was called from North America, Claude Akmoudi, but George was so ill that he had to leave 2 weeks before Akmoudi arrived. He was carried on a bed to a train and taken by train to Switzerland, but he'd left it too late. He passed away in February 1907. He had served in Turkey less than 12 months. Claude Akmoudi had arrived in Constantinople, today's Istanbul, in November 1906. You can see him here. I've highlighted him with the white arrow. This photograph, which we have in the archives, on the back simply says, "A group of believers in Asia Minor, Elder Claude Akmoudi standing in rear." By the end of 1908, also only 2 years after his arrival, Akmoudi was, he wrote to church leaders in Washington, D.C., so afflicted by poor health that I find it necessary to make immediate plans to come to America. And he did, in fact, return to America in January 1909. But his health was permanently affected, and he died on July 23, 1911. Now, George and Akmoudi had their situations exacerbated by a tendency to overwork, which was typical of many missionaries. Now, it was common among many Adventist leaders all around the world, something that couldn't possibly happen today, of course. There was a gradual laugh there. But overwork was particularly prevalent in the mission fields because there were far fewer Adventists, and so far greater burdens fell on those who were leading the mission work. Overwork was undoubtedly a contributing factor in the death in India of Doris Robinson, the first superintendent of the India mission who I mentioned earlier. And in fact, the Southern Asia Division is home to the remains of many Adventist missionaries. Robinson, who you see here, had been a missionary to South Africa, to Britain, and India, but when he died, it was not alone. Frederick W. Brown, a nurse, and his wife Catherine, a teacher, had sailed for India on December 14, 1898. They arrived at Calcutta on February 9, 1899, where they joined the staff of the mission located at Beau Bazaar Street. Here you see a group photo that, unfortunately, it doesn't include Fred and Catherine. In the summer of 1899, they were sent northwest to Ranchi, the capital of Bihar province. And in the autumn, a smallpox epidemic broke out in Bihar. But the Brown family refused to leave the region, which many Europeans did. Instead, the Browns, along with the Robinsons, you see here Doris and his wife Edna, they went to Karmata, where there was a small Adventist school and orphanage and almost no European medical care, and they started caring for smallpox victims. All 4 contracted the disease. Edna Robinson and Katie Brown suffered but survived. Their husbands both died. On December 21, 1899, Fred Brown passed away. He had been serving as a missionary in India for 10 months. The next month, his former classmates at Battle Creek in their graduation, Battle Creek Hospital and College, voted a resolution that his life and death shall be to us an inspiration to continue steadfastly in the work in which he has fallen, to bear the good news of salvation from sin, good news of salvation from sin and suffering to earth's needy ones. Meanwhile, on December 29, not long after Fred, Doris Robinson passed away too, having served in India for 3 years. Willie White wrote, "Overwork had unfitted him to battle with so dread a disease." Robinson's deputy, William Spicer, travelled up from Kolkata, and he later wrote, "I was with him in his last conscious hours. I told him that if he must lay down his work, perhaps God would use that to draw attention to India's needs. He replied with his swollen lips, 'Perhaps, I hope.' They were his last words, and expressed his hope, a blessed hope, that the third angel's message would suffuse India. 21 years later, of course, Eva Clements died in Rangoon, and her death in November 1920, remember just 7 months into her service, ended a bad 2 years for the Southern Asia Division, during which 7 church workers died. They included Edith Bruce, a missionary nurse who at least was a veteran missionary, having served in India since 1908. She died on October 12, 1920, 98 years ago tomorrow, at the age of 53. Her obituary paid a moving tribute, which is typical of how missionary deaths were regarded by their fellow workers. "We laid her to rest on the quiet slope of the lower ranges of the mighty Himalayas, until those ancient mountains shall catch the gleam of the bright morning, when Jesus shall come to redeem from the grave the saints whose death is so precious in his sight, and whose last resting place he marks so tenderly." And to these 7 dead in India and Burma, we could add Ernest Chapman, who didn't die in India but in his homeland of Australia. He and his wife Elsie had only landed in India on November 9, 1920, and by October the following year, Ernie was suffering so badly from tuberculosis that Elsie had to write his letters home for him. He couldn't hold a pen. On December 5, 1920, only 13 months after their arrival, the Chapmans sailed for Australia in hope that he would be cured there, but the hope was in vain. Ernest died in Perth on January 6, 1922. Friends, in 1919 and 1920, there were 110 missionaries, Adventist missionaries, in India and Burma. So this means that the average annual mortality rate, which is deaths per 1,000, the average annual mortality rate among Adventist missionaries to India in those 2 years was 83. Now, I've looked at studies by historical demographers, and this mortality rate contrasts sharply with that of Westerners in general, even though in 1919 India was suffering the influenza epidemic. But in 1919 and 1920, the death rate for Westerners in India was 25 deaths per 1,000. In other words, it was more than 3 times as dangerous to be an Adventist missionary as to be another Westerner. And in fact, we can see from this chart the annual number of missionary deaths in the mission field each year from 1903 through 1939, when the Second World War started. Having spent so much time with dying missionaries, I not only commend to you their spirit of sacrifice, I also want to draw attention to this fact. Despite the death toll, Seventh-day Adventists were not deterred from taking the place of deceased missionaries. Or rather, if some Adventists were daunted by high missionary mortality rates, there were always enough volunteers to replenish the fallen. And you can see in this chart, it compares the numbers of new missionaries going out, and you can see the death at the bottom is always very low. But notice the hundreds of missionaries who are going out. There were always more men and women, usually young men and women, willing to go. But at the same time, let's not understate what they were signing up to do. This third chart, I hope, brings home powerfully the death toll, which is calculated here as deaths per 100 missionaries sent. The death toll was considerable. And if the mortality rate of Adventist missionaries in India after World War I was bad, the death toll of Adventist missionaries in general up to World War II was such that no one could be sanguine about going to a mission field. And yet committed men and women still did go to the mission field, and they remained there for very, very long periods. 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, when they lived. Here's the amazing thing. These people went as missionaries, and they stayed in these countries knowing the likely outcome. They went as missionaries knowing it was likely to be a death sentence. The sources of much of the information and most of the quotations that I've shared with you this evening are reports written on their deaths and published in the church papers of the mission homelands. So every Adventist grew up reading the stories of the sacrifices, the suffering, the early deaths of missionaries. This was part and parcel of growing up to be an Adventist, knowing that going as a missionary meant you could well die. In fact, the issue of the Australasian Record that prints a brief notice saying Eva May Clements has been called to the Southern Asia Division. That same issue prints a story about an Australian missionary to India who had just arrived home very ill and was being treated. So people knew, and yet they were not deterred. We need to draw to a conclusion. I will pose and answer a question, and then I'll make a final point. Why did so many Adventist missionaries die? Overwork was a factor. And I could actually give a separate presentation on church workers who were workaholics and died early as a result. Maybe that will be for a future annual council. But there's another reason. Adventist missionaries of the late 19th and early 20th centuries did not remain in enclaves or in institutions. They got out and they got their hands dirty. They worked for the local people and they worked among the local people. Many Westerners, influenced by racism, tried to seclude themselves as much as possible from indigenous populations. Seventh-day Adventists didn't. They wanted to be among the people as much as possible so that they could emulate the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus Christ. In consequence, they were exposed to disease, and often they died. They died because they wanted to tell people of their Savior. And it is with their passion for sharing good news, a passion for saving souls, that we will end. And again, I could multiply quotations here, and I'll only share 3. In 1899, Fred Brown, who, as we saw earlier, died later that year in India of smallpox, wrote from London, where he and his wife would take ship for Calcutta, about how he and his wife Katie had felt as they left Battle Creek Station. Some of you may have heard the whistle of the train a few minutes ago. They were on the train from Battle Creek Station, and Fred wrote this: "As the train sped on its way, there was joy in our hearts, because we were taking the message of the third angel to that ancient land." Later, writing from Ranchi not long before he died, he fervently expressed the hope that God grant that many may see the truth and repent before it is too late. In 1902, after Albert Fisher perished of typhoid fever in Puerto Rico, another missionary, A.J. Hazemer, reported on his last days in the Review and Herald. I quoted part of that earlier, but now I'll quote some more. He wrote that he and Fisher had a final conversation in which Fisher expressed his desire. During this time, he often spoke of the work which he had only begun, and knowing his condition, he pleaded with me not to neglect the work in this island for the many precious souls here. And as we quoted earlier, he seemed to worry that his death would keep others from coming. But this is what Hazemer told him: I assured him that this would affect only the faint-hearted, that the true soldiers would be stimulated to press to the front, 2 or 3 taking the place of 1. And friends, that's what happened. Adventist missionaries pressed forward, 2 or 3 taking the place of 1. We began with Eva Clements, and we will conclude with her, and with her last known letter, written from Burma. In Calcutta, en route to Rangoon, today's Yangon, she visited a temple, and she saw Hindu pilgrims worshipping, she said, before an image of the goddess Kali. And what she saw stayed with her. In a letter to friends, she describes how the people are standing about 7 or 8 feet deep before this huge monster, and the guide cannot make himself heard for the shouting and shuffling in the endeavor to worship this cruel deception of the enemy. But her mind was not on the image, it was on the Indian people, for whom she continues, no privation, no sacrifice is too great for them to behold their God. Many having come long distances to this purpose, and I wonder, did she reflect that she had made a sacrifice, that she had come a long distance for the purpose of serving her God? But her mind turned to how these Indian people might come to know Jesus. She wrote, I pray for deeper consecration on the part of myself and others here, and for an inflow of workers from the homeland to this needy field. There is a great need and much to do. You who are young and can learn the language are the ones who are most wanted. You who hate the works of darkness and will, with the aid of the lamp divine, let his rays penetrate the gloom. Picture these poor people for whom Christ died. How can we let them know? Her last words, her last written words, are powerful. And they describe a need that is still urgent. Picture these poor people for whom Christ died. How can we let them know? Despite the extraordinary growth of the Seventh-day Adventist Church around the world, growth built on the sacrifices of missionaries, there are still billions of people for whom Christ died, but who do not know that he died for them. Before I began speaking, we sang, Seeking the Lost. The lost are found everywhere, but they're found in some places more than others. We have many believers now in China and India where so many missionaries died, and yet we still have to reach, in large part, the people of China and India. We praise God for the members there, but we have still yet to reach most people in China and India. And that's also true for most people in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, West Africa, and the people of great cities everywhere, including in Europe, once the homeland of missionaries. And the need is still there. How can we let them know? How can we let them know? How can we let them know that Christ died for them? It will take money. It will take prayers. It will take skillful use of technology and media. But what it will also take is this. It will take Seventh-day Adventists offering their bodies as living sacrifices so that others may know what we know. The everlasting gospel that must be proclaimed to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people. Would you stand with me and we will pray. Father, We thank you for Eva Clements. We thank you for all the others whose names are mentioned here. We thank you for the hundreds of Adventist missionaries who went so that people could know of Jesus. Forgive us that where we have forgotten them. Forgive us where we fail to live up to their example. May we be inspired anew to take up the challenge that you gave us in your Great Commission. And now, lifting up our minds to heaven, let us give thanks to the Lord our God, who through his beloved Son has purified us and gathered us together to be a chosen people to himself and to be witnesses to all nations. To him be all praise and glory for all eternity. Amen.
Please be seated for just a couple of minutes. I don't know about you, but my heart was challenged at the presentation that Dr. Trim just gave us about those whose footsteps we'll be walking in this weekend, figuratively at least, because many of them came from other places than Battle Creek. When I think back of what I've read about 100, 120 years ago, to think that over and over Adventism sent its brightest, its best to the mission field. Young people going to train stations, climbing on board those trains and waving goodbye, knowing full well, as he pointed out to us, that they might never see their loved ones again, and the loved ones knowing they might never see their young people again. What a legacy this church has. And I'm going to thank Dr. Trim for his presentation and bringing that alive to us this evening. I also, I'm wondering if Joyce Stoltz is here. She said she would come this evening, and I would like to present something to her if she's here, but I can't see a thing through all these lights. She's here? Oh, good. Joyce, please come down to the front, would you? And I want to introduce to you Joyce Stoltz. Her husband, Duff, as he is known, Garth Stoltz, was the one who actually had the dream, the first initial dream for historic Adventist Village. Sadly, he died, about a year and a half ago now, and I wish he could be here and see all of your faces. He would be amazed to think that his little dream that he had back about 1980 would result in the top leaders of the church having an annual council here in Battle Creek. But there is a new tour guide book. I believe you all received a copy in your bag. I'm told that it's supposed to be there. And so I would like to have Elder Wilson come up for a minute. He didn't know I was going to do this, but he also knows that I sometimes get a little impromptu sometimes. But I would like to have Elder Wilson present a copy of this new book, which is a tour guide of historic sites. You haven't seen us with beards before. So if you would be willing to present that to Joyce, and just as a token of appreciation for what she and her family and her husband did to make this whole place possible. And I also have copies of the book, signed copies for your two children, Amy and Garth. And now one last thing, I know we've had the benediction, but it just seemed to me like my heart wanted to respond. I don't know about yours. And there is a song in our book. It will not be on the screen because we were not planning on singing this. But number 10, I love to tell the story. So I hope you have your hymnal here. And we will sing the first and last stanzas, and then we will consider ourselves dismissed, remembering that if you want to come to the ribbon cutting ceremony for the publishing house exhibit, it will be immediately after we have finished singing. There will be a lighted pathway up towards where the building is. It's just a short distance from here. So let's sing the first and last stanzas, and we'll stand as we sing this old hymn, I Love to Tell the Story. I love to tell the story of unseen things above, of Jesus and his glory, of Jesus and his love. I love to tell the story because I know 'tis true. It satisfies my longing as nothing else can do. I love to tell the story. 'Twill be my theme in glory to tell the old story of Jesus and his love. I love to tell the story for those who know it best, seem hungering and thirsting to hear it like the rest. And when in scenes of glory I sing the new song, 'twill be the old story that I have loved so long. I love to tell the story. 'Twill be my theme in glory to tell the old story of Jesus and his love. Thank you very much. You are dismissed. As I say, for those who want to join us for the ribbon cutting ceremony, we'll exit around the tent, I guess, this way and up the lighted pathway to where it will be happening very, very quickly from now.